In May 2017, the UK Parliament Home Affairs Committee published their report on online hate crime, which concluded that social media companies aren't doing enough to tackle targeted online hate abuse, and noted that women, including female members of Parliament, have become targets for abuse and misogynistic harassment on social media, particularly Twitter. Less than 4 months later, the leading human rights watchdog Amnesty International used Twitter's own data to demonstrate the scale of online misogyny that female MPs were exposed to. They reported that abuse of this nature affects women from all UK political parties, and that the Shadow Home Secretary Diane Abbott had been particularly targeted during the June 2017 general election. In this video, we will examine some of the data that helped the Parliamentary Home Affairs Committee to reach their conclusions, reflect on the potential chill factor that online abuse trends may have on democratic processes, and consider the curious question regarding why one high-profile female politician is notably absent from Amnesty's top 10 most abused politicians.
Isn't it? It's something like 50 years since Germaine Greer said women have very little idea how much men hate them. Well, thank you, Twitter. Message received. And yeah, it is absolutely terrifying that these attitudes are out there. And in a sense, I think we should be grateful to the internet, because I think we're better off knowing what's out there than kind of living in this rather sort of wallpapered world of, like, you know, we only say nice, polite things. I think it's better that we know that these attitudes are out there, and then we can challenge them and acknowledge them.
Is it fair to say, because anyone can get abuse and get trolled online, but are women more prone to it? Women with a voice?
Yeah, all the evidence says that women get disproportionately large amounts. If you look at, there's a piece of research about MPs getting abuse in the run-up to the election, and they identified something like 900,000 pieces of internet abuse in the run-up to the last election, and 45% of them went to Diane Abbott, which tells you that it's along racial lines and it's along gender lines. You know, people are...
I found it essential to have a sense of humour when you're a politician, particularly if you speak out on inequality. Especially when I'm talking about gender equality, I now expect that my words will be misrepresented no matter how carefully I choose them.
While I was researching this series of videos on the theme of virtual abuse, I had an opportunity to talk to Jo Swinson, MP for East Dunbartonshire and the Deputy Leader of the Liberal Democrats in the United Kingdom. Jo is also a member of the Reclaim the Internet campaign group, led by Yvette Cooper, and has regularly spoken out on the issue of online abuse. Both Jo and her husband, Duncan Hames, are in a relatively unique position to comment on the gendered nature of online abuse trends, because until May 2015, they were both serving members of Parliament. Jo confirmed that over this time, they had both observed a significantly higher frequency of electronic abuse directed at female MPs, and that this was borne out by their own mutual experience. Such a perspective is commonly reported by many MPs and by the House of Commons authorities, who frequently claim that women and ethnic minority public servants face an especially overwhelming amount of inappropriate communications from the general public. Jo and I disagreed about the approach adopted by the Reclaim the Internet campaign, and most particularly their perspective on the extremely broad range of language or behaviours that could reasonably be described as abusive. Nevertheless, I don't doubt the sincerity of her claim that she receives considerably more abusive comments on social media than her partner. However, no matter how thin you slice a thing, there will always be two sides. And it struck me that two aspects of their combined experience should be highly relevant to any study concerned with attempting to measure the frequency or impact or gendered nature of online attacks on public servants. Hopefully at least one of these should be relatively obvious to anyone with the most rudimentary knowledge of research methods, and I will share my thoughts at the end of the video. But the main purpose of this video is to consider how well the narrative about the apparently overwhelming scale of online misogyny that is pushed by groups like Reclaim the Internet stands up to scrutiny. And to do that, we have to examine the evidence currently available on online abuse trends, including evidence cited by Yvette Cooper in her role as chair of the Parliamentary Home Affairs Committee when calling for enhanced state powers and sanctions that she believes are needed to reclaim the internet from those who would do us harm. And in fairness to Yvette Cooper, while there are always two sides to every story, research findings from a range of relatively diverse and credible sources do certainly help to build a very convincing picture about the current scale of online misogyny. In September 2015, the United Nations Broadband Commission published a report that urged governments and industry to work more effectively together to better protect women and girls who are victims of cyber violence. The report claimed that 73% of women online worldwide have suffered cyber violence and was described as a wake-up call to what has become a worldwide pandemic. The summit followed in the wake of the notorious Gamergate controversy that had rocked the gaming industry the previous year, and a series of disturbing high-profile examples of online misogyny across social media platforms, including an incident involving British Labour MP Stella Creasy and feminist campaigner Caroline Corrado Perez, which resulted in the sentencing and imprisonment of two internet trolls who had been among a number of people to direct abusive messages towards them, including threats of rape and physical violence. Less than a month after the UN issued their alarming call to action, another female member of the UK Parliament was reportedly subjected to a torrent of abuse, rape and death threats on Twitter after she made a passionate speech about the underrepresentation of women MPs. Like Stella Creasy before her, Jess Phillips turned the attention to her advantage and has since become a high-profile and outspoken advocate for tougher measures against perpetrators of online misogyny from both the criminal justice system and notably from the social media providers who act as hosts and arguably sometimes even profit from their hate. Speaking in October 2017 at the time of the launch of the UK's National Online Hate Crime Hub, Phillips warned that the government were still only paying lip service to the issue and that all too often victims of online abuse don't come forward when they face hate, intimidation and threats because they feel that they will not be taken seriously. But there is certainly an increasingly convincing and serious narrative which pulls together research findings from a range of diverse and seemingly credible sources that can be used to support the United Nations claim that online abuse is reaching pandemic proportions and that women and girls are especially vulnerable. In the same year that the Gamergate controversy significantly increased awareness of the issue of online abuse in the public consciousness, the Washington-based Pew Independent Research Center published a report that estimated that 4 in 10 American internet users had experienced online harassment, and that young women are particularly vulnerable to sexual harassment and stalking online. Similar trends have also been reported in the UK, such as a report from the strategic insight agency Opinium in spring 2017, which suggests that almost half UK schoolgirls will have experienced some form of online harassment. But while girls and young women may be especially vulnerable, increasingly there are also concerns that women who enter the arena of public life in professions such as politics, journalism and public policy making can increasingly expect to be singled out and subjected to often horrendous abuse, sometimes on an almost daily basis, especially when they speak out on the issue of women's rights. This has led groups such as Global Citizen and Amnesty International to voice concerns that this phenomenon has potentially dramatic implications for democratic processes and that it will inevitably create a chill factor, discouraging young women from entering public life. Amnesty have warned that especially for women and marginalised groups, social media platforms are a critical space for individuals to exercise the right to freedom of expression, and that online violence and abuse are a direct threat to a natural right to free speech. Such concerns have opened up a global debate about what social media platforms should be doing to respond to the misogynistic abuse that has apparently become so prevalent online. The Guardian newspaper has been at the vanguard of this movement for some time, and in 2016 launched a campaign entitled The Web We Want, which was aimed at encouraging dialogue about how we can all help to end online abuse and promote better conversations on the web.
Why does the writer always write dumb articles? Nice smile, but no substitute for a brain. More often than not, it's just a bunch of dudes telling you to shut the fuck up. You know, how do you respond to a comment saying you're stupid, right? Like, where's the debate in that?
Not every fucking thing has to do with race, Thrasher, and you're ruining this site with your racist bullshit. Well, I mean, if I had a dime for every time I heard that. I don't mind, people saying that they think I'm factually wrong or politically wrong, but it's really draining dealing with what I think of as abuse.
It would be good to have Nasreen make it entirely clear where she stands on ISIS. Well, if you'd read the piece, then you would have known. When people say I get very annoyed, I get very upset when I receive negative comments, I think it's the biggest compliment that you can get. It's very flattering because you think I have managed to amplify my voice into corners of society where they have not heard from people who look or sound like me or who are saying anything like I've been saying, and surely that means you're achieving something.
To mark the launch of the campaign, The Guardian commissioned research into the 70 million contributions to their website's comment section since 2006 and discovered that approximately 1.5 million comments had violated The Guardian's own community standards, largely because they were considered to be abusive in nature. Because they wanted to test the theory that women experience more abuse than men online, their methodology also examined trends relating to gender, and disturbingly they found that out of the 10 most abused writers, 8 were women. The top 10 was rounded off by 2 black men, which further supported anecdotal observations from both writers and comment moderators that ethnic and religious minorities and people from the LGBT community also appear to experience a disproportionate amount of abuse. In the same month, to mark the official launch of a parliamentary cross-party campaign entitled Reclaim the Internet, Demos published a study that found that 10,000 tweets were sent from UK accounts in a 3-week period, aggressively attacking individuals as a slut or a whore, and that such comments were predominantly directed towards young women, and also identified African-American pop star Azealia Banks as the most targeted recipient over the period. Remarkably, less than a week after the launch of this campaign, one of its supporters, MP Jess Phillips, was widely reported to have been subjected to over 600 rape threats in one 24-hour period, after she wrote an article in support of the campaign, which was targeted by a high-profile and controversial YouTube vlogger. The following month saw a significant spike in reports of online abuse, especially racist abuse, in the run-up to the hotly debated national referendum over Brexit. Less than a week before the vote took place, the nation witnessed the tragic and brutal murder of Joe Cox, Member of Parliament for the English constituency of Batley and Spen. Cox was murdered by a loner with an obsession with far-right ideologies, and a number of high-profile people believe there is a direct link between her murder and the increasing narrative about online misogyny. Disturbingly, after commissioning a study into online behaviour in the immediate aftermath of her murder, the anti-extremism group Hope Not Hate reported that there had been more than 50,000 tweets from 25,000 separate Twitter accounts, either celebrating her death or describing her killer as, among other things, a hero and a patriot. In the week that Thomas Mayer was subsequently sentenced to life imprisonment, MP Jess Phillips revealed that the group who attack her most online are without question those who would identify with the alt-right, and that Cox had received online hate messages from far-right groups in the weeks prior to her murder. She also warned that the internet is being used to radicalise angry white men and called for the government's prevent strategy for counter-terrorism to be extended to include misogynistic hatred. Here's a quote. The alt-right, or as I like to call them, racist fantasists, are in a frenzied state about the fact that their efforts have delivered Donald Trump to the White House and sealed a top job in his team for Steve Bannon. They are emboldened like dogs on heat and are currently flipping the final switch on a project of radicalization of young white men that they have been undertaking for years, using the exact tools deployed by ISIS and other terrorist organizations before them. The alt-right have been grooming vulnerable young men or isolated people online with fake mocked-up videos of hatred. They've been finding people with no friends and offering them a brotherhood. Like every man who groomed a lonely teenage girl with the promise of love, affection, and the gift of popularity, the racist fantasists followed the playbook and recruited en masse. They are homegrown hate preachers. Each individual who joins in a fevered dogpile of hatred against a dissenting voice thinks they are acting as an individual with free speech and free will. The reality is that they are part of an organised, radicalised group whose creation took planning and discipline by each cell and its leaders. The Parliamentary Home Affairs Committee has strongly criticised social media companies for failing to take down and take sufficiently seriously illegal content, saying they are shamefully far from taking sufficient action to tackle hate and dangerous content on their sites. At the beginning of 2017, the BBC surveyed more than a third of the UK's 195 female MPs and reported that an overwhelming majority of them have received online abuse, with many of them considering quitting as a result. Over the last few years, there have also been an increasing call for misogyny to be added to the list of recognised hate crimes, and some police forces have already moved to introduce this classification within their own jurisdiction. And when the Parliamentary Home Affairs Committee issued their investigation findings into online hate crime, which called for urgent action, their report highlighted the prevalence of misogyny directed at women online, including one report finding that showed that 70% of female respondents who had received abuse on Twitter said that they had experienced sexist harassment. The report also referenced specific examples of abuse experienced by female MPs. In a further effort to understand just how much abuse women MPs face online, Amnesty International spent the first half of 2017 in the run-up to the June UK general election analysing Twitter data, with a particular focus on the 6 weeks prior to the election itself. Amnesty wanted to use Twitter's own data to demonstrate the scale of online abuse that female MPs were exposed to, and they concluded that women in politics face an extraordinary amount of abuse on social media, in part simply because they are women. They also reported that online abuse cuts across party lines, affecting women from all UK political parties, but that Black and Asian MPs receive significantly more abusive tweets than their white colleagues. And remarkably, Diane Abbott, the Labour MP for Hackney North and Stoke Newington, received almost half of all abusive tweets identified in the run-up to the election, and again led one of the world's most respected human rights watchdogs to call on governments to enforce adequate laws to prevent online violence against women, and for social media companies to respect their human rights and take measures to protect the right to freedom of expression. Amnesty International notes that the right of freedom of expression protects expression which may be offensive, deeply disturbing and sexist. However, freedom of expression does not include advocacy of hatred or violence. What's more, the right to freedom of expression must be enjoyed equally by everyone, and includes the right for women to express themselves and live free from violence and abuse, both online and offline. Social media platforms explicitly state that they do not tolerate targeted abuse on the basis of a person's gender or other forms of identity, and they now need to enforce their own community standards. They should also enable and empower users to utilise individual security and privacy measures such as blocking, muting and content filtering. This will allow women and users in general to curate a less toxic and harmful online experience. There can be no doubt that online harassment directly can have profound real-world consequences for people who encounter it, ranging from mental or emotional stress to reputational damage or even even fear for one's personal safety. However, just as it is incredibly difficult to achieve a consensus on what should or shouldn't be considered as abusive language or behaviour, there are extremely differing views concerning what can or should be done to protect people, especially children and vulnerable adults. And one concern arising from identification of these remarkable trends in online behaviour is that any rush to regulation may have profound, far-reaching and potentially unintended consequences for free speech and democracy. A key theme examined throughout this documentary series is a concern that the plight of genuine and vulnerable victims of abuse can be undermined and even endangered by those seeking to exploit the phenomenon for their own personal or political purposes. And there is certainly also an increasing body of evidence to support the concern that the interpretation of data, the disproportionate emphasis on particular research findings, and even initial research methods concerning internet abuse are being tainted by narrow and non-partisan political interests. In 2017, the Pew Research Centre published a follow-up report to their 2014 findings. These two reports serve to bookmark the research findings that we have considered so far. Pew reported that while 62% of Americans view online harassment as a major problem, they're extremely divided on how to balance concerns over safety with the desire to encourage free and open speech. An estimated 43% of Americans say that offensive speech online is too often excused as not a big deal. But an even larger proportion feel that many people take offensive content online far too seriously. Two significant outcomes of both the 2014 and 2017 surveys was the finding that while men and women experience online harassment in relatively similar numbers, overall men are in fact more likely to experience abusive behaviour online. And while women are twice as likely to experience harassment of a sexualized nature, men were 33% more likely to be called offensive names or receive threats of physical violence. There are, of course, many nuances to Pew's extensive findings, but even though these surveys are based on responses by North American internet users, the fact that men on average are more likely to experience online abuse does beg the question that if men and women are experiencing this type of abuse at relatively similar levels, exactly how much consideration did the Parliamentary Home Affairs Committee give to the experience of male internet users when preparing their report? In my humble subjective opinion, the chair, Yvette Cooper, and her committee colleagues have quite significantly downplayed the online experience of approximately 49% of UK internet users when considering online abuse. And this becomes relatively transparent when we take a second, more critical eye at some of the findings that have helped to develop a narrative suggesting that there is an epidemic of misogyny sweeping through computer screens in the United Kingdom and beyond. No matter how thin you slice a thing, there will always be two sides. And a second, more non-partisan review of the data considered so far does rather disturbingly reveal that some of this proposed epidemiology is built on very thin ground indeed. None more so than the United Nations' extraordinary claim that 73% of women worldwide have experienced cyber violence, and that cyber violence is as bad as violence in the real world. Less than a month after its publication, but with considerably less fanfare, the UN report was withdrawn pending revision after it was shown to be littered with inaccuracies, and that its headline statistic, promoted in support of their call for government interventions to address a global epidemic, was revealed to be based on a sample of less than 400 callers to one American helpline for people who were specifically experiencing online abuse. A spokesperson for the UN suggested that the numerous and wide-ranging errors contained within the report were caused by a scramble to publish in time for the launch date. Errors which included blank citations, definitions with no source, and one particularly controversial reference claiming a link between video games such as Pokemon and real-world killings. And it is worth noting finding that a revised version was never produced, and that the online report is still available to download from the UN website. Presumably most people watching this will be aware that there are certainly two sides to the story, commonly described as the Gamergate controversy, which featured so highly in the United Nations report itself. For the uninitiated, here's an extremely succinct summary of the side of that particular story that doesn't portray it as a harassment campaign against prominent women in the video games industry.
Gamergate is a consumer boycott and a call for ethics reform in game industry media. Evidence comes up that a writer at Kotaku gave a game favorable coverage because of a relationship he had. Kotaku says that this isn't true. More evidence comes up proving otherwise, and people demand he gets fired. Adam Baldwin shows support by creating the Twitter hashtag Gamergate. In response, Kotaku and many other sites published 14 different articles, all saying the same thing: gamers are dead, all on the same day. Readers declare a boycott on these sites and begin contacting their advertisers. To fight the stereotype, the hashtag #NotYourShield is made because minorities like myself hate having game journalists pretend to speak for us, especially since some of them are racist. Reddit's rGaming starts censoring all forms of Gamergate discussion. Even 4chan censors Gamergate. This leads to a mass migration to a much better website. Feminist scholar Christina Summers releases a video debunking the idea that video games make people sexist. Game sites call her a conservative. She's a Democrat. Milo Yiannopoulos leaks emails from a private Google group called Game Journals Pro, proving that game journalists collude to shape narratives. Corruption is also exposed in award shows like IGF. Not wanting to associate with such hacks, one by one advertisers start to pull out, with the latest one being... Oh, and one last thing. If you hear anyone say Gamergate is about harassment or misogyny, laugh in their stupid face and remind them that we donated more than $70,000 to help women make video games, and no game site would talk about it.
The extremely gendered perspective placed on some of these research findings can have significant implications for the way public policy makers act. For example, over 2 years after the UN's headline statistic had been debunked, the Home Office referenced it in their most recent strategy for addressing crimes classified as violence against women and girls, in support of the claim that women and girls are significantly much more likely to be exposed to online abuse. Such evidence suggests that much of the interpretation promoted are not accidental. Such realities should not serve to undermine the fact that internet abuse is a very genuine issue for those who experience it, or that there are certainly significant gendered aspects to take into consideration when seeking solutions to address it. But by the same token, it is also important that relevant data is both analysed and reported responsibly, and if necessary, used to challenge the credibility of claims by those who will inevitably choose to cynically exploit the existence of this phenomenon for their own personal or political purposes. Both Pew studies reported that young women are perhaps the group most exposed to types of online abuse, and that they are more likely to experience certain types of high-impact abuse, such as stalking. But the Pew research and previously mentioned research by Opinium, which incidentally was commissioned by a children's charity with a specific focus on greater equality for girls, found that young men are exposed to similar and only slightly less levels of online abuse as young girls. And crucially, the research indicates that roughly a quarter of all young people surveyed have experienced mental or emotional stress as a result of online harassment. Such examples show that much of the interpretations promoted are not accidental and are clearly ideologically driven, a fact that becomes even more apparent when you consider the behaviour of some of our politicians, and even more crucially, the perspectives presented by some high-profile thought leaders in our so-called Fourth Estate. Take the Guardian newspaper's analysis and commentary regarding online abuse on their own doorstep, presented under the banner, "The Web We Want." As a large number of their own readers pointed out in the corresponding comment sections, their findings regarding both the proposed level of abuse in their comment section and its gendered nature are extremely questionable, especially given that their own methodology clearly establishes that their analysis counted any and all moderated comments as an indicator of abuse, regardless of which of the 10 different community standards the censored comments had been judged to have breached. Many of the reader comments under articles featured in the Web We Want series point to a popular concern that the Guardian fairly unsubtly inflated their claims about abuse from within their own customer base by conflating reasonable factual disagreements censored by heavy-handed and biased moderation with actual criminal criminal or abusive conduct, which the same report acknowledges is extremely infrequent. Their moderation approach has been frequently criticised as mirroring an increasingly popular victim-aggressor tactic of the regressive left, which involves shutting down debate and discouraging dissent by accusing political opponents of acting in an abusive or intolerant manner. Some of their own presumably problematic perceived readership also pointed out that the analysis will have been skewed even further by the well-documented understanding that Guardian moderators are notoriously inconsistent and can be especially oversensitive or overzealous in the moderation of some sections, particularly where readers are more likely to proactively police the comments and report anything that they perceive to challenge their preferred editorial dogma. This includes notoriously provocative articles by high-profile feminist columnists, which are often criticised for their quality, controversial narrative and is being cynically promoted as clickbait designed to drive traffic to the Guardian's website.
Imagine going to work every day and as you're walking into the office, you have 100 people. You're walking through this gauntlet of 100 people being like, you're stupid, you're terrible, you suck, I can't believe you get paid for this. It's a terrible way to go to work.
It feels like handing in homework to a teacher and having it corrected by 1,000 different people.
Further evidence of the Guardian's tainted approach is evidenced by their unwavering and relatively uncritical promotion of both the Reclaim the Internet campaign and some of the extraordinary and politically advantageous claims made by the Labour MPs that have led it. For example, coverage of the Demos findings into research commissioned by Yvette Cooper for the campaign launch featured an image of a crowd of angry, middle-aged white men, despite the fact that in reality, Demos had found that the majority of abusers identified by gender were in fact female, many of whom were fans of Heartthrob's One Direction and had participated in a flame war with controversial rapper Azealia Banks after she had directed a number of racist and homophobic slurs at him, which eventually led to her permanent suspension from Twitter. And when their political editor interviewed Yvette Cooper for the series, they found themselves agreeing that the problem isn't just about things that are actually unlawful, and possibly the most revealing moment of the entire series reflected on fashion journalist Polly Vernon's experience of low-level online abuse. The article described how Vernon had been left feeling dehumanized, mildly depressed, anxious and body dysmorphic after experiencing an outpouring of online criticism, which had left her utterly disinclined to write with honesty about her life experiences, and revealed that a relative disengagement with Twitter was the only way that she could bear to continue writing. What it failed to mention was that Vernon reported that her abusers were almost exclusively women, and more specifically champions of the political ideology of feminism, and that her traumatic Twitter dogpiling experience was largely triggered by a scathing review of her book about feminism in The Guardian itself. Both The Guardian and champions of Cooper's Reclaim the Internet campaign claimed that the Demos research provided a glimpse into the true scale of online misogyny by men. However, critics questioned the reliability of this claim, particularly when it was revealed that the identified gender of the majority of perceived abusers were in actual fact female. A finding that mirrored the results of a similar study conducted by Demos the previous year, which was also subsequently replicated in a much larger study examining 19 million tweets over a 4-year period. They also criticised the narrow and relatively subjective perspective of the methodology commissioned by Cooper, which, like the scope of the Reclaim the Internet campaign itself, concerned itself only with looking for evidence of abuse aimed at women. Noticeably, its methodology completely ignored the findings of a much larger study also conducted by Demos the previous year, which analysed over 2 million tweets to high-profile Twitter users and reported that overall, men in public life were almost 4 times more likely to receive abuse than women, and that male politicians were the group that on average were most likely to receive abuse. As did the report into online hate crime, by the parliamentary committee, chaired by Cooper herself, which only referenced the much narrower 2016 report when it concluded that women in particular have become targets for harassment on social media. Interestingly, another demo study that didn't get a mention was the one that estimated that 1 in every 15,000 tweets sent by UK users and written in English will contain a racist or ethnic slur, and that the 3 most commonly identified slurs were, in reverse order, whitey, packy, and white boy. Remarkably, other than an anecdotal reference to reports of abuse sent to MPs, the main other additional evidence cited to support the report's claim about the prevalence of anti-women rhetoric was an informal survey by the UK's leading feminist charity, the Fawcett Society. This survey received responses from a grand total of 182 people, 97% of whom identified as female. A fact which begs the question regarding exactly how reliable is the other evidence and citations the committee included in their report. I haven't considered this question in any particular detail, but it is interesting to note that the outcomes of the once much heralded crowdsourcing initiative coordinated by Yvette Cooper's Reclaim the Internet campaign didn't get a mention. I look at this more closely in the episode in this series which documents the slightly muddled history of Yvette Cooper's campaign. Incidentally, the first episode in this series examined the widely broadcast claims that MP Jess Phillips has been on the receiving end of torrents of Twitter rape and death threats on at least 4 separate occasions, including over 600 rape threats in one 24-hour period. And my conclusion was that the closest thing to a viable rape threat currently available in the public domain can be sourced back to a tweet sent by Jess Phillips herself. How or whether to respond to certain types of language use without curbing freedom of expression in this online space is a significant question for policymakers and thought leaders alike. And one important way that parliamentarians can help to protect everyone's human rights is to ensure that a robust effort is made to strike a balance between protecting young and vulnerable people online and the civil rights of every adult expressing their opinion in a democratic society. Nevertheless, to date, most studies examining online abuse trends have consistently identified that abusive tweets are more generally the exception rather than the rule. For example, Demos research into anti-social media and racial slurs found that very few examples of tweets that presented an imminent threat of violence or where individuals directly or indirectly incited offline violent action, and also concluded that slurs are most commonly used in a non-offensive, non-abusive manner to express in-group solidarity or non-derogatory description. Again, this finding failed to make it into the parliamentary research report, although it is interesting to note that some of the research cited in support of concerns about anti-Muslim hate crime was conducted by Dr. Imran Awan and Dr. Irene Zempi, who were also the authors of a significantly muddled report into online behaviour in the immediate aftermath of Jo Cox's murder. This report into their research project, commissioned by campaign group Hope Not Hate, described widespread celebration of Cox's death on social media, a claim that was repeated by some of Britain's largest newspapers after The Guardian received an advance copy. However, 2 weeks later, these claims were withdrawn after an investigation by The Economist found that Hope Not Hate had significantly misrepresented their findings in their initial press release, and that in reality, very few celebratory tweets were discovered at all. The Economist estimated that the true number of tweets cheering the politician's murder was between 0 and at most 1,500, and although Hope Not Hate acknowledged that its initial press release was misleading, the researchers, Drs. Awan and Zempi, declined a request to share the data they had used to make their conclusions, citing death threats that they had allegedly received following the report's publication. As I stated earlier, there have been repeated attempts to in some way link Jo Cox's death to this ongoing narrative about online abuse and misogyny, but very little, if any, coherent evidence exists to support this claim. Cox may very well have been the very first ever female MP to be assassinated, But she was also the first ever Labour MP to meet such a fate, the first MP of any background in over a quarter of a century, and the first MP since 1812 not to be killed in the name of Irish nationalism. Cox was killed by a mentally ill constituent with links to the far right, who targeted her in the week before the Brexit referendum because she was a passionate defender of the European Union. He didn't own a computer, is not reported to have had any social media accounts, rarely even sent texts from his pay-as-you-go mobile phone, and in my humble subjective opinion, the memory of this much-loved mother of 2 young children has at times been casually and cynically exploited by those determined to push a particular narrative about online misogyny. The main purpose of this video is to highlight the curious phenomenon of parliamentary representatives and significant sections of the mainstream media persistently pushing a narrative promoting and possibly unrealistically playing up the level of online abuse, whilst also significantly downplaying and frequently simply ignoring any so-called abuse experienced by men. In the last 2 episodes of this series, I will consider why this might be, but clearly one of the most significant and common concerns highlighted to date by all sides involved in debates about online abuse are about the potential implications for democratic processes and, more widely, freedom of speech. This was certainly the main concern highlighted by the human rights watchdog Amnesty International when they published their findings about online abuse witnessed during the 2017 general election. They claimed that the extraordinary amount of online abuse faced by women in politics was a worrying human rights issue because there is a real danger that it will have a chilling effect detrimental to the level of representation of women in politics, as well as continuing to deepen societal inequality between the genders. One of the outcomes of Amnesty's research findings that particularly surprised me was the complete absence of some of the most high-profile female politicians participating in the election from the list of those who had been identified as experiencing the most abuse. Now, this may in part be explained by the fact that all of the female leaders of parties competing in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland were not personally standing for a parliamentary seat. But nevertheless, it struck me as unlikely that in such a hotly contested election that a relatively low-profile MP from the Scottish Nationalist Party had somehow found themselves on the receiving end of more hostility and abuse online than the UK's Prime Minister, Theresa May, even in the context that the Scottish MP in question had been caught up in something of a localised Twitter storm during the election, which led to her apologising after posting false rumours on Twitter about a nurse who asked her leader an embarrassing question during an election debate. Given that Amnesty were calling on social media companies to introduce better safeguards to protect users from such slander, another aspect of their research that I was curious to learn more about was whether or not it had been possible for them to correlate if Twitter's current safety functions, such as block, mute and report, had any impact on the number of abusive messages sent, particularly by the most active perpetrators identified, and the percentage of comments actually seen by their intended victim. So I approached Amnesty with some questions about their research methodology and their outcomes, and found their response to be as surprising as it was potentially revealing. Initially, they were quite enthusiastic, offering to arrange a discussion via Skype and asking for some more detail about my particular interest and focus. But when I explained that my main focus was on the potential exploitation and misrepresentation of the online abuse phenomenon for political purposes, particularly censorship, their tone changed significantly. They responded by insisting that they had been flooded with requests and that before we speak, it would be useful if I would clarify what I plan to do with the information and also forward links to any previous work that I had done in this area. This seemed fair enough as far as it was fair enough. So I explained that I was working on a video series entitled Virtual Abuse for my YouTube channel, The Glass Blind Spot, the aim of which is to offer observations focusing on blatant bias and obvious blind spots in corporate media narratives. I explained that the focus of the specific episode episode I was working on would be an examination of the available data on online abuse and whether there is any evidence of selective or subjective reporting of this, potentially for the purposes of promoting particular political narratives. I also explained that the following episode would examine evidence of censorship, chilling effects on political discourse and free speech, and how exaggerated reporting about the levels of online abuse may potentially be dissuading women and people from minority backgrounds from entering public life. I also included a link to my most recent output, which had looked at some of the extraordinary flaws in the UN report on cyber violence, which had recommended sweeping state interventions. And I told them that I was especially interested in discussing the difficulties or issues around how, when, and what should be defined as abuse, and to explore similarities and differences in methodology between Amnesty International's approach and the similar research conducted by the University of Sheffield. Incredibly, I never heard back from them, even after sending a follow-up request. I guess it's possible that their inbox had become so flooded that they couldn't even send a polite no, but then again, perhaps they just didn't want to get into a pesky page-for-page comparison with Sheffield University's research report, which despite having similar aims, produced very different findings. Both methodologies involved undertaking an analysis of close to 1 million messages sent by Twitter users to members of Parliament. But while Amnesty had cast their net over a 6-month period up to the date of the general election, Sheffield focused on a much tighter period, taking in the immediate run-up to the June 8th date. And while their time frame for capturing evidence of abusive tweets was much narrower, they did widen the net in one very significant way, which presumably explains why their findings were so different. Because while Amnesty's research findings may not unreasonably have left you with the impression that Diane Abbott received an extraordinary proportion of all of the abuse directed at MPs during the election, Sheffield University found that in general terms, the percentage of tweets flagged as likely abuse made up between as little as 2 and 4% of all tweets sent to politicians on any given day. Significantly, having widened the study to include male politicians, Sheffield found that when their findings were broken down by party and gender, male Conservative candidates were identified as the group receiving the highest percentage of abuse, followed by male UKIP candidates, followed by male Labour candidates. They also found that the overwhelming majority of insulting tweets were targeted at a relatively small number of well-known and very prominent politicians, with only Jeremy Corbyn, leader of the Labour Party, receiving more abuse than the Tory leader, Theresa May. Diane Abbott was included in the list of the top 10 most targeted figures, who together accounted for over 70% of all abusive tweets sent to politicians during the period. But with the exception of Theresa May, she was the only female politician in this list, and the level of abuse directed at her was significantly less than that experienced by the top 5 predominantly male candidates in the list, who between them received a grand total of over 50% of the total abusive tweets sent to politicians in the month of the election, all of which serves to cast a heavy shadow and a healthy question mark over Amnesty International's narrative that women, especially ethnic minority women, and most especially Diane Abbott, are being specifically singled out for abuse. And it also begs the question as to why would a seemingly reputable human rights watchdog want to push such a narrative if it is in fact misleading? In the absence of any comment from them, I've been left to come to my own conclusions, and in my own humble subjective opinion, the reason is fairly obvious, albeit with a mild sprinkling of slightly complicated. Broadly speaking, certainly in Western societies, we have a tendency to be more naturally sympathetic towards the welfare of the female of the species. And there is plenty of evidence to indicate that both sexes are generally hardwired to put women in the lifeboats first. Psychologists sometimes describe this as the empathy gap, which has obvious relevance for campaigners seeking to capture the sympathy of the general public on a problem relevant to human beings in general. And it must be again emphasised that online bullying and harassment is a genuine issue to be addressed, and And while many feel equipped to address it simply by ignoring, blocking, or at most reporting it, for some, online harassment can have a very profound real-world consequences, including mental or emotional stress, reputational damage, or even fear for one's personal safety. Children and young people are perhaps especially vulnerable, but there are inevitably also gendered factors to take into account. Both Pew Research Center studies found that while men are overall more likely to experience abuse and threats of violence, women, especially young women, encounter sexualized forms of abuse at much higher rates. And more generally, women were found to be twice as likely to describe their experience as extremely upsetting. To an extent, such factors help to explain why there is so often a much greater emphasis on the impact of violence on women, be it in real or virtual realms. But in my own humble subjective opinion, the reason why such esteemed institutions as the Fawcett Society, Amnesty International, The Guardian, the BBC, the UK Parliamentary Home Affairs Committee and the United Nations should all experience such dramatic blind spots when it comes to over 50% of the evidence that might actually support their calls for action. And that is quite simply that it is in their own interests to do so, as well as to play down any suggestion that there may have been a little over-egging in some of the evidence that they have chosen to champion. And in the last two episodes of this series, I'm going to take a closer look as to why that might be. But I promised I'd finish with two observations about Jo Swinson's claim about experiencing more abuse on social media platforms than her husband during his time in Parliament. The first is the fact that during Duncan Hames's one term, Jo Swinson had a significantly higher profile with positions as a parliamentary undersecretary and junior minister in David Cameron's coalition government, not to mention a significantly more active social media presence. And as the evidence shows, the bigger your profile, the more likely it is that you will get it in the neck from some twat on the internet. But more importantly, although there is no suggestion that her partner left public life specifically because of his experience, Jo Swinson did acknowledge that he also witnessed harsh language and sentiment being directed at him by members of the public during his time as an elected representative. Which begs the question, if a member of parliament significantly believes that there is a genuine need for the state to take such significant and intrusive steps to protect people like her from harsh language from constituents, then why on earth would they sign up to such a blatantly sexist campaign that rather disingenuously throws most of her work colleagues out of the apparently much needed lifeboat? No wonder the Liberalists were disgusted.
Can't you see it too? There's an elephant in the room.